Hi, everyone. Welcome to ECON 2111. So, today we are concluding the differences within Canada that speak to the French Canadians. And so, we're going to be talking about what made the French Canadian poor in a way that allows us to explain why is Canada as a whole poorer than the United States, historically speaking. So, to tackle this, we first have to go through some form of myth busting in the first place. And then we have to jump back to the institution we saw last week when we did the lecture on New France. We're going to go back to the institution of Seigneurial tenure in order to explain why the French Canadians are poorer than the English Canadians in a way that explains differences of Canada as a whole to the United States. Okay, so the way that we are going to start with the myth busting part is this concept that's really popular in Canadian economic history regarding the economic history of Quebec. And it says something along the line that the part of Canada where Quebec is, and remember, Quebec is by the point we're going to be talking about it, it's going to be known as is what we discussed last week, New France. So Quebec is the area that's along the St. Lawrence River. Uh, that's where the settlers, the French Canadian settlers, were located. And in 1760, the British conquer New France from the French and then make Quebec become a British colony. And following the status of Quebec as a British colony, there is this idea that it suffered through what is known as an agricultural crisis. Now, the argument for the timing of that crisis is debated, but most people will tend to point at the first few decades of the 19th century. So, somewhere between 1800 and 1840. And the idea is that during that period, there was a prolonged agricultural crisis that made the French Canadian very much poor. And the thing we have to explain is that if there was a crisis, that could help explain why Canada as a whole is poor, if that's what made the French Canadians poor. Now, the mechanism that's been proposed for that agricultural crisis is that the French Canadian were big farmers of wheat. And it's important here because wheat, which you can use to make flour and bread, was heavily exportable to British markets. And so it was a good that, as a really small colony, because Quebec is not big, Quebec is at a time of conquest and even 40 years later, not more than 100,000 people. Well, it's a bit more than 100,000 people by 1800, but that small population pales when compared with that of England, with its many millions of people. And so the ability to export to British markets means that whatever the British demand is, the French Canadians can supply it, and it will be whatever they supply has no impact on prices because they're such a small and open economy. So the idea was that this wheat staple could be used as a growth engine. But the problem is that during the period, the price of wheat, so that's the argument for the agricultural crisis that people have advanced, is that the price of wheat actually fell so that there was a lesser rate that was obtained on British market. That was the first thing. The second argument that's made is that Quebec became a net importer of wheat at a certain point in time, and that is the argument that's being advanced. That it's like, aha, see, it's not even able to. So not only is it that the British market is inaccessible, they're physically unable to produce it in Quebec. Maybe in part because there's a series of important shocks to the crop itself. So there's the thing called as wheat rust, which is a disease for plants. There's the Hessian fly, which was a mosquito that would lay eggs into the endosperm of the wheat kernel, and what it would do is basically destroy the plant and make it uh, completely unconsumable. And so you combine these together, and you get this argument that look, this key agricultural output is just flagging, so that the colony cannot grow economically. And one last argument that's added to this, and we've killed that one already, so you should know why the agricultural crisis is not going to be very important in our storyline once we do proper economic history. That there's a lot of it that's blatantly wrong without even though being entirely false. And there was this argument, the one that we know is entirely false though, is this claim about economic mentalities of the French Canadian, which were supposedly inferior economically to the English Canadians. Uh, Now, how does this like statement for the agricultural crisis stand as an historical claim? Well, to be sure, when we look at the volume of exports of flowers relative to what is imported in terms of flour, for the first few decades of the 19th century, Quebec is indeed exporting flowers. So this is a surplus of flour that's exported on foreign market. But starting in the 1830s, you can see that it drops down, obviously. Like this is pretty obvious. And so this idea here is that's where the crisis is like clearest. The French Canadians are not producing this beautiful wheat that can be exported to England or to American markets, and then not only that, but the British remove the preferential access that Canadians had, so that becomes an even bigger problem because now they're outcompeted by Americans. It's a whole mess. But this has like a big problem in terms of a graph. Is well, first of all, we have to remember what we saw in principles of micro. If somebody else can produce wheat better than you, that means you can actually be importing it. That means you're actually paying a lower price for your food. Uh, Given that this is a fact that I'm giving now, that the French Canadian population was increasing and that it was being better fed, this is probably a period when the French Canadian were able to import uh, bread, bread stuff, so flour and wheat, at lower price than they would have had they themselves been invested in farming wheat. But the other part that really makes it really weak as an argument is when you consider volumes. So here, what we had was imports minus exports. But when you just look at exports alone, there never was a golden age. In fact, for most of the 19th century, it looks like it's a flat line and very few quantities are being exported. And in fact, it's near the end when supposedly, because notice here, this is after the 1840s, right? There's a big boom in wheat exports that starts picking up. And this is wheat exports per capita. So this is okay. How does this match with this guy here? Because this guy here says it just got worse. Well, maybe, but we were still exporting larger quantities in general. So if we just consider the idea that as a net we are exporting, but we're also importing, it means that and we're exporting more and importing more. The volume of trade has increased. If the volume of trade has increased, by definition, you can't really argue for a crisis anymore. So, just for that reason, we should already be somewhat skeptical of that claim. But what about this idea that the French Canadians were just also like bad farmers? Well, when we say bad farmers, it's because they had some form of economic irrationality, that they were unable to maximize, to find better farm practices, uh, that they were unable to exploit knowledge about new crops and new ways to farm and how to better use the land. And if you remember from lecture three, sorry, here I say team two, I should say team three. My bad, this is a typo. Uh, you've seen this idea that you can't call people with the past irrational morons because you're probably just not having all the information about the decision that they made, or that you just haven't put yourself to the empirical test. In fact, if you remember very well from lecture 3, we actually used the French Canadians as a prime example of whether, like, you could make the claim that people from the past were irrational morons who were unable to engage in economic calculation. We saw that this was wrong because we could take the different areas of Quebec, so know their agricultural output. We could, so this would be Y. We know their capital, so how much animals they have, how much land they have, and then their labor, how many workers that they have. And we could estimate at least Y, K, and L. And if you make assumptions about alpha and beta, you can, by rearranging this equation, you can get A on the other side, right? So you would have basically A is equal to uh, uh, Y over L and K. But the what's even better is you can do it for both groups. So you do it for the English and the French farmers. Because if the argument was that the French were just bad farmers, then the areas populated by French farmers should have less of this, holding all of this constant. They should have less of this because this is lower, the A, and A here is the efficiency, how well they're able to use the capital and the labor effectively. If there's any difference in Y, holding K and L constant, then the entire difference is due to differences in A. So if you were to write Y1 equals A1, K1, L1, and 1 being French, and then you do the same thing with Y2, A2, K2, L2, being now 2 being the English, you can reorganize this as a ratios of ratio. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but it looks exactly like this. The ratio of output in the French area over the output in the English area, that ratio divided by the product of the labor ratios and the capital ratio, so how much labor the French have relative to the English, and the English, then the capital, the French relative to the English. That will give us, by definition, this gentleman here, which is the ratio of their technological efficiency. If we do believe that the French were inefficient farmers, right, so that they were just bad at it, they were not able to engage in production choices that maximize their their output, so they were just unable to use labor effectively or use capital effectively alongside labor, we should see that this should be less than 1, right? So that the A1 is smaller than A2, so that the number is inferior to 1. Well, the thing is that's not what we find. We actually find that, and this is the guy you want to look at here, the TFP. TFP is A. That's another name we have for A, right? A is also known as total factor productivity, TFP. And you can see here in this table that, well, this is the A1 over A2. The French Canadian areas are, yeah, they're you know, like an iota behind the English Canadians, but not by much. I mean, the worst case scenario is that they're maybe 6.7% less efficient, all else being equal. In here, it's not all else being equal. Here, just like the raw numbers, right? This is not like a really strong statement. And at best, there's like a zero point 0.5 gap. So take the mid range. It's not, doesn't appear to be like a very big deal. But this is not holding everything else constant. We don't know about the land quality. Is there like something in terms of the where they are settled? Do they get like worse farms? Do they are they further away from markets? Are they less connected to waterways and rivers that allow them to bring their produce to market? Like these would be like exogenous features that have nothing to do with the cultural differences. And when we try to do regression analysis, where you control for stuff like land quality, land per capita, like how big the farms are, if there's economies of scale, how well specialized they are, if there's a big education sector that draws kids out, and here like the cleared land is like how big the average farm is as well. Then you have the years since settlement, so it's like how new is the place, because places that are have just been settled tend to have virgin lands, and virgin lands tend to be more productive than lands that have been settled for a long time because there's been no soil erosion on them. There's no like land fatigue, if you want. Well, if you take the TFP we saw on the previous slide, right, and we regress it over these exogenous factor, and we check what happens when you account for the share of Catholics is used as a proxy for whether the place is French Canadian or English Canadian, because back then in the data we have here, which is, I should have said, for the 1830s, right? If there is a disadvantage, if there's like, sorry, if you're French, you're Catholic, and if you're not French, you're not Catholic, period. So here you can use the share of Catholics as a proxy for whether or not a place is French. And you can see here that in, so just look at the coefficient. This is a positive. This is a positive. So it actually goes in the opposite direction. Now, when we use other types of econometric method, sometimes it's a negative, but in no cases is it significantly different from zero. So I don't know how many of you in my class have taken econometrics, but sometimes you're bound to estimate things, and the estimators that you get, such as this row of numbers here, will have, you'll be given values, but they may not be representative of, they might not be significantly different from zero. So that difference, given the variance in the population that you're observing, you cannot say that it's significantly different from zero, because here this row of numbers with parentheses is like, this could be, you could add this number in both directions, right? And you would know where you are. So you could technically be above zero if you added this to that, and you could technically be still below zero if you added it to it. So this is like saying it's not significantly different from zero, right? So you can't say that there's no effect of this particular variable. So here, what you're forced to say is that, look, the cultural variable doesn't matter at all. By the way, when it is significantly different from zero, you get the little stars right here. This is how most economists denote the presence of statistical significance. Now, we can rule out this argument about culture essentially. Okay, so where do we go next? Well, the other argument that was made for the story of the agricultural crisis was that wheat prices were falling. And the argument that is made, and at first glance, it doesn't seem entirely stupid until you know some economics, uh, is that if wheat prices decline, then farm revenues will decline, right? So if the farmer gets a lower price, well, he's going to get lower incomes. Well, that could very well be, but you have to make two assumptions for this. The first one is that the revenues from wheat that you get must outweigh, as a share of your total farm revenues, must must be like gigantic. So that would be like something like 90% of your income comes from wheat. And with that, you have to accompany another assumption, which is that you can't change to other crops. So you either do wheat or you do nothing. These first assumptions, these first set of conditions, just don't apply for Canada. First of all, we know that even at the get go, when the French Canadians were farming the most wheat in their history, it was less than a third of their total revenues. And once potatoes were introduced and oats became a viable crop, especially for feeding horses, because the French Canadian were well known uh, for having amazing horses. There is such a thing as, like in North America, the French Canadian horse, which is a very sturdy beast of immense pulling power and very well fed. And what the French Canadian would do is generally export these horses to other British colonies, but even sometimes the United States. These horses were immensely valued as an export good, but they would have to feed them, and they tended to feed them oats. But the guy who grew oats, sorry, to feed horses, well, that's part, and he sells it to somebody who's a horse herder. Well, you are basically doing what? Well, he's earning revenues from oats. So once you start checking at the sources of revenues that farmers add, wheat wasn't a really, it wasn't a minimal deal for sure, but it wasn't a big enough deal to to hold this condition. And in fact, it gets weaker over time. By the time we enter the period of the agricultural crisis, uh, it's 25% of farm revenues come from wheat. And so it doesn't really hold very well. The second condition that you have to make is that the demand for wheat must be very price elastic, so that any rise in the price of wheat leads to a substantial reduction in uh, in farm and the total revenue that accrues to the farm sector. And you can just draw in your head, draw a demand curve that is perfectly flat, and then draw a supply curve and see what happens to quantity if, say, the supply falls or the demand just goes down a little. Check what happens to the income of the farmer in this case, and you'll notice that there's a really big decline. So if the demand is very elastic, that assumption could still be true, even if the first one isn't, right? So it could still lead to a reduction if, like, it's like 25% I've mentioned of income that comes from wheat. If the demand is like highly elastic, then okay, I you could be wrong. Or it could be that each time the price of wheat that the Canadians would get from the British market leads to a massive reduction in demand, so that it transforms into not a reduction in demand, sorry, a reduction of income. Uh, well, to sorry, I thought I was gonna sneeze. Sorry, that will look stupid on the video, but my bad. Uh, if that assumption is true, then the claim that falling wheat prices would confer the impression of like an agricultural crisis. Okay, that could be true, but the thing is that we know it's not elastic. We know it's actually very inelastic. We have a lot of evidence that the demand for wheat is relatively inelastic. So that one just doesn't hold water very well. So we can kind of kick it out pretty much. Now, the other thing is that even the notion of a crisis is very weak. The evidence is actually that there's probably actually positive economic growth, not a decline in living standards. See, if you remember from your introductory economics classes, you had this term here, this equation, and that was the probably sought under the label of the classical dichotomy, which refers to the idea that nominals determine nominals and reals determine reals. So here, what you have is the stock of money multiplied by the speed at which money circulates. the multiplication of these two will be equal to the price of goods times the goods themselves, right? This is essentially saying that the nominal value of all the of the money supply, right, is going to be equal to the nominal value of the goods being exchanged. That's a pretty simple statement. But from this, you can actually make some neat inferences about economic growth. Because if you say, let's hold V constant, right? So let's imagine that this guy doesn't move. And now I tell you that this guy, M, is going up. Then all I need is to give you another piece of information about either of those on the other side, right? To know what's happening. And especially if I tell you, so remember, this one goes up, this one doesn't move. And now I tell you that this one falls, right? So up, nothing, falls. What has to happen to this guy? It has to increase. Because if you have to respect the equality between them, Y has to increase. So that hypothetical I've just given you is not a hypothetical. It's actually what happened. Because we know from the evidence we have from the banknotes that private banks issued, the inflow of specie. So specie, by the way, when we say that for the distant passes, gold coins, right? Gold and silver coins. And you add in any form of things that you could call like a monetary mean of exchange, like it's like a medium of exchange, you find that these guys are going up. So M is going up. And what we have also is we know from price indices that prices are going down massively. So what we can do is, okay, can we make assumptions about V to know what's happening to Y? And the thing is just to give you an idea, this is the expression of how much prices are collapsing. The agricultural crisis is argued to have happened from 1800 to 1850, and this is the evolution of prices. So this is a price index of different goods consumed, and you can see that the price level here, like this is a scale, which is an index, and everything is scaled up to 1845 to 50, having a being the base year. Well, you can see that the decline is that the prices fell actually by roughly a third. That's a pretty big price decline, like over a 50-year period. So if you assume certain different changes in velocity, what has to happen to Y, right? So given that we know what happened to prices and we know what happened to the money supply, M, can we make assumptions about what could have happened to Y? Well, if we assume that velocity had not moved at all, economic growth would have been somewhere on an annual basis would have been somewhere between 3.78 and 4.72%. So that's positive economic growth. Now, it's unlikely that there was zero velocity change, so the V in the equation. If we just like import numbers like those we know for the United States happen, so this is like minus 2%. If it's minus 2%, then you actually get something like rates of between 178 and 272. And once you convert it into per capita term, you get very modest economic growth, right? So you get somewhere between, yes, some decline depending on the price index you use. But the one I'm citing here is one that nobody actually uses anymore because it only has agricultural good. It doesn't have like manufactured goods. It doesn't have services. It doesn't have timber. It has like only 5 or 6 crops or something like this. That number is probably the less reliable of them, right? So, by the way, when it says with Geloso, this is a price index. That's my price index that I've computed. Paquet Wallo is another price index that's been computed, and Willetanol is another price index that is. So there's 3 different indices that show prices. The one I'm showing you here is my own, the one I calculated, uh, and it tells you that, and I think mine is the most reliable. Uh, it tells you that there was a rate of growth. If you take the worst case scenario for velocity, uh, it's 0.2% extra per year. So there is economic growth. And in fact, when you try to look at other indicators, this is confirmed. So, for example, import per capitas. So, import per capitas are a really good proxy for economic growth because they tend to increase. And in terms of the amount, they tend to increase in proportion to the volume of trade, and the volume of trade tends to increase in proportion to total output. So if you see that the the part of the economy that's the part of consumption that's imported is growing on a per capita basis, and you don't have any reasons to believe that this is just because you're importing much more than you were before, but you're also producing much less. If you have like no reason to believe that there's a change in proportionality, then this is actually telling you that everything is being scaled up with this graph here. Hence, you can rule out also from this angle. And I think the best way to look at it is I inverted two graphs. My apologies. If you take real wages, so I'm going to just go show you this graph first, and then flip back to the next one, the one that was there before. Uh, this is the evolution of real wages uh, in different contracts in Quebec, so that the French Canadians received, deflated by the price index over the period 1688 to 1850. And the idea here is that you want to fit a trend line of time. So, how much on average over time were wages going up? And the idea is you want to take wages also, as we saw in lecture two, to be a proxy for the marginal product of labor. And here, what you can see is look, oh my God, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up. Well, the thing is that this trend, right, the trend is 0.15% per year, which looks a lot like what we had here, right? So it seems that the trend that we're getting using wages matches the simulation that that we've made. So we can kind of rule out this idea of uh, of of a decline in living standards. So it's pretty clear that there is an increase. But the thing is this is small. This is not big. And neither is this. 0.15 per year. That's like saying your income will double every hell 2 or 300 years. That's not cool. In fact, if you look at this one here, in the span of the period of 175 years, incomes barely doubled. That's that's disappointing. So yeah, there's no crisis per se because there's no decline. A crisis involves the idea of a decline, but this is not glorious either. Right? This is not something you're like, oh wow, this is great. We're not. At least we're not falling. Yes, we're not falling, but if you compare with everybody else, and what I want you to focus on here, forget this one at the bottom, the D, the 1D. Look at A, B, and C. This is the difference between, and we've already seen this graph in lecture 5. This is a difference between upper and lower Canada. And you can see this line in the box, the whisker box here, the one in the middle. This is the average for lower Canada in wages per day. And this is for upper Canada. And this is just in shillings per day. So, okay, there seems to be some difference. But the fact of the matter is, there's also something that we need to account for. Prices for wheat in lower Canada were much higher than in upper Canada being here, lower Canada being here. Well, if we divided the wages by the prices, we can get like an estimate of real wages over space, which is C. And now you can see that the difference is much bigger, right? This is like between those, I know it doesn't scale really well on the graph here, but this is 0.42, this is 0.42, 5.3. This is a huge gap. This is like a 25% difference between the two places. It's not negligible, right? So this idea is that this guy here, Upper Canada, which is Ontario, which is the neighboring area of to Quebec, where the French Canadians are, was pulling ahead. And in fact, if we had a graph on this one and we had shown the limited, and I tried to do it because it would have been necessary, but the data for Ontario was not the greatest, and it doesn't scale really well. But you would have seen something along the lines of Ontario starting at 1800, just going like this, having like a clear difference where it's increasing much faster than Lower Canada and is leaving Lower Canada, Quebec, leaving Quebec behind in terms of improvement. So there would be this emerging gap between them. Okay, so now that we've kind of said that the agricultural crisis is overblown as a statement, that it can't be explained on the fact that French Canadians were, for some reason, just illogical, irrational, stupid, or something like this, and that the wheat crisis argument is pretty like tenuous, and actually I say tenuous, but I should say undefensible. What we're left with is still a problem, is that even if you take the best case scenario, so let's say like I'm like everything I've said is 100% correct. And even if by the way, if I am 100% correct, we still have to explain why it doesn't grow as fast as the other places of North America. Right? And if I'm wrong, and I could very well be wrong, because like a lot of what I'm mentioning here is from some of my own work, why would there be, like, even if I was wrong and the agricultural crisis was true, we'd be even harder pressed to explain why there was this gap that emerged. Obviously, like let me rephrase this. When I say I could be wrong, I mean I could be wrong about whether or not there was an agricultural crisis. My claim is that there was no decline, but everyone agrees that the explanations that have been provided for that crisis are wrong. So when I showed you these slides, right? So this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one, and this one as well. When I showed you these were explanations for why you couldn't tie the explanations of the agricultural crisis as very valid. Afterwards, what I showed you was that there was no agricultural crisis. That's what I was trying to argue to you. So let's say I'm wrong about whether there was an agricultural crisis, so that there was actually, like, there was a crisis, right? But we reject the explanations provided. We would actually have to provide an explanation now, because it's like, just going around whacking around stories that people have made is not very productive. That's not very scholarly to do. Generally, when you try to rip apart someone's explanation, you kind of have, at least in the medium run, to provide like a counter explanation. But even if we accept that the agricultural crisis didn't happen, we also have to explain why the growth was like very modest. So we're left like with this big puzzle that we have to deal with, which is, how can we explain the fact that the best case scenario still has the French Canadians doing much worse than everybody else? Well, this is where we want to bring back our talk about the institution of seigneurial tenure. If you remember in the last class when we talk about seigneurial tenure, and I'll do a recap again so that way you don't have to go back to the previous video and stuff like that. When we talked about seigneurial tenure, what I argued to you was that the institution was, because of the taxes that are imposed by it, it altered the returns to migration from the old world to the new world. And by altering those returns to migration, fewer people would come. And because you couldn't qualify Canada as a Malthusian economy, because there was so much land available, because the the constraint of the Malthusian world, which we discussed in lecture 5, right? This idea that there's like a barrier there's like a limit to economic growth in a world of no changing technology, which is that you have a limited amount of capital, and eventually the marginal return on the next unit of capital that's being used is going to be inferior to the previous unit of capital you've used. And so the income you get on average per person just actually has to, up to a certain point, has to fall, right? So that was the Malthusian mechanism that was presented. But in a world where there's like so much land out there, the Malthusian mechanism doesn't exist. So when the institution of seigneurial tenure limited the ability of having people come in, you actually were preventing the gains that came from having more people, which is more specialization, greater economies of scale that are still present when you're so far away from that boundary that's imposed by the Malthusian world. But that feature is probably the least horrible of the institution of seigneurial tenure. So let's talk a bit more. So let me do a recap about what seigneurial tenure is. Seigneurial tenure is the king gives to landlords an estate in Quebec, where the French Canadians are. And when he gives that estate, the landlord, is forced to give land freely to the peasant. But the peasants cannot own their land, and they cannot leave their land unless they sell to somebody else to replace them on the freely conceded plot. So they have to sell the right to the other person. And once they sell that right, they have to give 1/8 of the proceeds of the sale to the landlord. So this is known as exit barriers, right? So what the seigneur were doing, and the tax that says like you couldn't leave legally, right? That was a de jure restriction. But the tax that came on top of it that said you could only leave, right? So you couldn't abandon your land and just run away. If you ran away, you could be brought to court. But with the Loyalists, which is the tax that I just mentioned, if somebody wanted to change where he was and just move to new and better land, he would have to find a buyer. Once he found a buyer, he would have to give 1/8 of the value of the sale to the landlord. So it's essentially a tax on moving away. So for people who are within these estates, they can't leave easily. And now the other part that's important is that the seigneur, the landlords were also known as seigneur. I'll keep saying landlord, but if I slip up and say seigneur is the landlord. So he's the guy who's been given the estate by the king. The seigneur, when they were given this estate, had this ability to tax people who settled on their land. So they had to give the land freely, but they could charge like these taxes once they're on their estate. But it didn't apply only to farmers. They could apply to anyone who came in, like people who operated their own businesses. Say, I'm an entrepreneur who tries to open a factory to make t-shirts. Well, they wouldn't make t-shirts back then, but to make clothing and garments. I would have to pay the seigneur taxes. But notice there's something weird here. If the seigneur operates here, which the taxes that apply to peasants also apply to competing manufacturers. So if a landlord operated his own garment factory, he could say, okay, now you enter business, you have to pay me those taxes. And if ever you want to sell your factory to another entrepreneur, you have to give me 1/8 of the value of the factory, which is pretty much another tax on entry. And on top of all of this, the landlord also had some actual monopoly rights. So it's not just that he could erect barriers to entry, he actually had legal rights to certain resources that nobody else but them could exploit. That applied, there was a bit nebulous legally because it wasn't clear if the law actually said that, but they did claim that they had that monopoly, and they did try to enforce it, that they were the only ones who could take out timber from their estate. So they were the only ones who could operate sawmills. They were also the only ones who could operate flour mills where you would convert wheat into flour. So they had like a series of monopolies. Now, if you're a good economist, you can actually pile on these two sets of well, these two sets, these all of these features here, right? The entry barriers, the exit barriers, and the monopoly rights that I've mentioned. If you pile them on together, they actually amount to what is known as a monopsony. In your I don't know if you've seen this in Intro to Micro, but a monopolist, what you would see in that class, was a single supplier. A monopsonist is the reverse. It's a single demander. So a single demander, what a single demander will do is reduce the quantity that he wants, but he reduces the quantity that he demands so as to lower the price so much that he earns an extra profit from doing so. And here you have just that, where the what is being produced, what is being hired is workers. So if a seigneur or landlord, has like a clothing factory, or has uh, a sawmill where he converts wood into wood planks that serve to make ships or stuff like this, he can decide how much worker he will hire. And by choosing how much worker he hires, he basically sets the wage rate. So he actually can pay them less than what a competitive market would offer workers. But add to this the fact that normally you could say, oh, wow, workers are being screwed. Well, technically, that wouldn't be a problem if workers could just move around. They'd say, oh, you know what? I'm just going to leave your estate, right? I'm going to go to this other guy over there, or this other guy over there. But if they can't move, they can't do anything. They don't have any exit options. So then in this case, the combination of these two work in a way to have the landlords, the seigneur, make a very substantial profit. And this is where the story is important, because the institution of seigneurial tenure works in this way. The landlords are able to depress wages in a way that actually makes their activities more profitable. And what they're doing is they do so to exploit their monopoly power that they have on entry for into certain sectors, and they use the fact that workers cannot uh, cannot exit. So by being monopolists on certain market, they're monopsonist on the labor market, and because they're monopsonist on the labor market, they offer lower wages than the competitive rate would have been. And as a result, and workers have no options but to take and accept these wages, and also accept less employment in total, so that total income is reduced by a greater proportion than what the wage rate is reduced. So, how do we assess how big of a deal this institution is? Well, when the British conquer, they keep the institution of seigneurial tenure, and they keep it for 30 years as is. They don't change anything about it. There's actually British people who start buying these institutions because seigneurial tenure haven't been implanted by the French. The British, when they take over, they actually buy back some of the French estates, uh, and uh, and there's quite a few of the landlords who end up by the 1790s being actually British people, like English speaking individuals. And for these 30 years after the conquest of Quebec in 1760, the British keep the institution of seigneurial tenure. But then the American Revolution happened a few years before 1790, so 1775 to 1783. And once the British concede independence to the Americans, there's the what are known as the American Loyalists, those who would remain loyal to His Majesty George III, and they moved into Canada rather than stay in the United States. When they moved, they were very hostile to settling under French land laws. And so they pushed for the abolition of seigneurial tenure. The British government refuses to abolish it, but doesn't want to keep it either. So they strike kind of a middle deal. And the middle deal is that every area that had been settled up to 1791 stays under French legal law. So they remain under the seigneurial tenure system. And everything settled after 1791 is settled under the British freehold tenure. And under the freehold tenure, the one that is under British law, the institutions, all the features I've mentioned, the monopolies, the inability to leave your land without paying a tax, all of this doesn't exist. There's basically a much freer labor market on the English law side, and there's also a freer products market, so you can more easily compete for the production of certain goods on the English law side as well. So none of the features of the seigneurial tenure regime exist right across a geographical border within Quebec. And that's really useful because for 6 decades, until the system is finally abolished, the two systems, the French and the English law system, live side by side, right next to another. There's no big difference in land quality. There's no big difference in access to markets. They're very similar places. And the only difference that really is that exists between them is the institution itself. So how does it matter? Well, I just want to show you a map of what it looks like. This is a map of Quebec. So this is the St. Lawrence River right here. And the areas that are drawn with the line, here, the one that my mouse cursor is following, these are the areas that by 1831 this is the frontier, of the institutional regime of seigneurial tenure. So everything that's within these lines, as denoted by squares, are under French seigneurial law, right? So they're the French law side. Everything that's outside is under the British law, right? So there is places within the area. You can see that there's like some British law areas, some British law areas here, some British law areas here, one here, some here, like a little one hidden right there, a few right here, and it looks like this. And there's actually like a patch here as well. Well, this line, right, this boundary right here is something we want to exploit to explain the differences, right, economically, that the institution itself causes. Because if you're right here, so let's pick like this guy right here. Like you can see that this guy right here has 2 neighbors. They're very close to each other. If you just look at the scale of the map, right, this is like a 12-mile difference. It's not a gigantic geographical difference between this guy and this guy. They're pretty close together. The idea here is that if the institution matters, crossing this boundary means that you cross into a completely different world, right? Even though everything is the same geographically or very similar geographically, just crossing this line means that you become poor, because we expect that on the French law side, where it's a little square, you are restricted to a high degree in your ability to move as a worker, and that you don't get a lot of exit option in terms of employers because only the landlord has businesses in your area that will hire you to do some work on the offside. So that gap here, if the institution is significant, crossing the line should cause you to go massively richer. And we have data that allows us to test for this. There is a census, the census of 1831 for Canada. And you can see here, by the way, it's in French, so you're not probably reading it. This is the name of the workers. Do they own their plot? Do they have a house? What's their profession? How many people in the family? By the way, look at this, how crazy this is. This guy is called Louis Sévigny. He's the owner of his house, right? So he owns the place he's on. He's a farmer, but his family is 14 members big. So that's a huge family, right? But this guy, we can actually also learn a bit below what what wages here. So this is in French. I'll translate. This is the price of wheat in the area where that farmer is. This is the wages that he earns per month, right? And this is the wages that he can earn per day. So here you get information in each of the different little dots here, right? You get the wages per day, the wages per month, and the prices of wheat. So you can actually get a measure of wage differences, but if you deflate the wages by the prices, you can get a difference, you can get an estimate of real wage differences across the colony. And the idea here is we want to use the idea that I mentioned when I was showing you the map, that crossing the demarcation line between the two institutional regime should, if the institution matters, cause a jump in wages. And not only that should it cause a jump of wages, there should actually be more industrial activities on the English law side because there's more entry and there's more competition for labor. And do we see this? The answer is yes. So this graph here is normalizing all of the areas we had with at zero is the line, right? So if you go back to here, the black line that pops up here, that everything is expressed afterwards as the closest range that this place has to carry to reach the line, and this place, right? So everything is expressed on this as A, right? So this line here, this line is zero. So that's at the frontier. If you're literally like this guy over here, you're like, you know, maybe a kilometer away from the boundary. So you're very close to it. And on the left side, where the red line is, this is the French legal side. On the side where the blue line is, this is the English legal side. And what you can see is that the regression fit, right, the one that minimizes everything on this side, it follows like a particular trend here. And as soon as you cross over, the wages jump, right? So you have a relationship where deeper inside the seigneurial zone, wages are down. Then as you move closer away, so as you move towards the exit of the French seigneurial zone, your wages go up a bit. But as soon as you exit the French seigneurial zone, your wages go up massively, right? And just look at the difference here. We're talking from 25 to 35 shillings per month. So 35 over 25 should tell you how big of a difference it is. You can do it with the daily wages, and you see the exact same thing. With daily wages, you see a slightly different pattern within the seigneurial area. But as soon as you cross over, you see the same pattern, but it's a level higher. And you can check it with this. So these ones are the nominal. So this is just we haven't deflated for the price of wheat. And when we deflate for the price of wheat, the results are even bigger. Here you can see it's 4 versus 6. Here it's 0.25 versus 0.38. This is a big jump from just crossing over into the non-French law side. So the institution of seigneurial and tenure appears to matter very heavily. And you can try it with different estimation techniques. So here, the regression fit that we place on the data is using polynomials. If you use linear, so you just don't use any polynomials, it's even starker, where you have like very big, not only level change, but trend changes. The areas that are deeper inside, there's some signs that the areas that are deeper inside the non-seigneurial zones, or the ones that are British law, are actually even more competitive because they don't get contaminated by these guys who are close to them. There's more competition the more you're into the English law side. That's a pretty big finding. And just to give you an idea, the effects that are described on these sets of graphs, they amount to the equivalent of saying that wages were depressed by somewhere between 17.5 and 47% relative to the non-seigneurial places. These two proportions here are sufficient to explain the vast majority of the gap between Quebec and Ontario. It actually explains close to 80% of the gap between Quebec and Ontario, and it eliminates roughly a quarter to half of the gap with the richest of the richest places in the United States. So we're talking New England, Pennsylvania, New York. So Quebec, just by accounting for the differences within Quebec caused by this, right? We actually find that most of the gap with the rest of Canada is closed. And rather than being the poorest amongst the rich, if the institution's effect is accounted for, Quebec would have been amongst the richest of the rich, and Canada as a whole would have been amongst the richest of the rich. So that's a really big deal. So this one institution, the seigneurial tenure system, on top of what we've discussed in the lecture on New France, where it reduced the overall level by making the colony less productive, it also had this effect of changing the trend so that over time, it actually depressed industrial development, it depressed wage levels, it depressed productivity growth in ways that when we check at it, we end up with being forced to state that, oh gosh, the gap is well explained. That what explains the gap between French Canadian and everybody else helps explain the vast majority of the gap between Canada and the United States. That one institution has a really big deal. And I will add to this the role that the institution had in the long run. So early on, the institution of seigneurial tenure had another effect. Uh, by uh, by discouraging, by taxing certain forms of investments more than other, because there was also a bias within the seigneurial system discouraged capital intensive agriculture. And for most of the 19th century, that's not an issue because most agriculture is just land intensive and that's it. But when there is a boom that happens to the dairy sector, and the dairy sector is very capital intensive because you need a lot of equipment to convert milk into cheese or into butter, and that massive capital investment is very costly. But the early advantage that non-seigneurial areas had in the production of 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 dairy output, of being better able to make capital investments, they had an early lead for when the boom in dairy production happened. When that boom happened, by the way, we're talking late 19th century. They had an early lead. So only the non-seigneurial places could partake into this big expansion of a very a very export oriented sector that was the export of butter and cheese to foreign markets. But the areas that used to be under French law could not partake because of the restrictions that had long existed and had discouraged a certain pattern of specialization. So the institution of seigneurial tenure is really like a big deal. So how to recap everything. So first of all, the claims of the agricultural crisis are overblown. There was probably mild growth. Uh, and even if I'm wrong that there was mild growth, right? So that there was some like minor, modest improvements. The explanations that have been proposed for the crisis clearly are wrong. There is no way to defend them. There is no theoretical justification for them. Uh, the second one is that you cannot argue that this is due to the French being bad farmers. In fact, we know that they were probably as efficient as the English farmers. But it is clear that even the best case scenario has the French Canadians lagging behind in terms of living standards quite substantially. So, what explains it? Unlike the institution of mercantilism that we had discussed earlier, seigneurial tenure is a very good candidate for explaining the gap between the French Canadians and the English Canadians in ways that explain accidentally, right? As soon as you explain that one, you've also explained most of the gap between Canada as a whole and the United States. The reason why I say this is that the French Canadians are such a large part of Canada, demographically speaking, that if you were to imagine a world, a counterfactual, where they're as rich as the numbers I've shown earlier would suggest, then most of the gap between the Canada with a counterfactually richer group of French Canadians, most of the gap between that counterfactual scenario and the United States is much smaller than the one we actually observe where the institution is present. So that's it for this week. I'm going to wish you a happy week and everyone keep safe. We'll see each other soon. I hope I wasn't too terrible. I got a cold, so my voice sounds horrible. I'm sure. I hope that wasn't too tragic for you guys. But I will see you soon and keep safe. Cheers.